This weekend, we depart from the regular readings of the season after Pentecost, known as the Propers, and we turn our attention to a rather peculiar feast in the liturgical year, All Saints' Day. Doing a little research on this feast, I learned that it's a very ancient one, dating back to at least the mid-2nd century, following the martyrdom of Polycarp, one of our early church fathers. From what I can tell, the feast was primarily a local one and celebrated at different times throughout the year, depending upon who the local saint was that they were remembering. Early on, the saints remembered were those who were pillars of faith, who either did something special to bring Christ to where Christ had not been, who performed some type of miracle, or who died for the faith they profess. According to Catholic Online, there were thousands of such celebrations in the early church. It wasn't until the early to mid-700s when Pope Gregory III established November 1st as the official day of celebration that the feast began to take its more modern shape of All Saints Vigil, All Saints Day, and All Souls Day. The vigil was a time set aside for prayerful remembrance. All Saints Day, a special day of commemoration to remember those who gave of themselves so completely. And All Souls Day, a day to pray for and remember those who had not. The vigil of the feast, what we call All Hallows Eve or Halloween, has evolved a lot over time. From what I could glean from my research, in the Middle Ages, the poor within the community would go house to house asking for soul cakes. And receiving this donut-type food, they would then promise to pray for the souls of the departed. And that's probably where we get trick or treat from. The custom of masks and costumes developed much later as a way to mock and maybe even confuse the evil spirits by dressing up as one of them. I noted that Christians still go to the cemetery on Halloween, not to practice evil, but to commemorate departed relatives and friends, often with picnics and the last flowers of the year. For many Christians, the customs that have developed around the vigil seem to mock evil more than celebrate it, and reflect a belief that evil has no power over us. Still, it's not uncommon for many Christians today to refuse to observe Halloween, considering it to be too pagan. The sad thing is, many of those who do so sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, because they also, most of them, don't follow up and celebrate the rest of the feast either. Others, partly out of convenience, and partly out of their understanding of what it is to be a saint, take the rest of the feast, kind of like we do, and pack it into a single event. Remember, in the beginning, All Saints' Day was about remembering the saints who were the pillars of local faith, who either did something special to bring Christ where Christ had not been, who had performed some type of miracle, or who had died for the faith they profess. As the feast took on a more global nature, after Pope Gregory, that list, like I say, became rather long. So the Roman Church decided to narrow the parameters of who could be a saint. And in doing so, they focused on what they considered the creme de la creme of would-be saints. And this worked well until the time of the Reformation, when the authority of the institutional church was challenged, the church in Rome, and became more localized. people once again began to ask, who are the real saints? Question we still ask today. In our tradition, for years, we have had a book called Lesser Feast and Fast, and maybe some of you remember it. And in it we listed all those our tradition recognized as saints. And each had a day that we remembered them on for their efforts to spread the good news of Jesus Christ. Our tradition has added to that list over the years, finally culminating in a recent publication called Holy Women and Holy Men. Maybe some of you have seen it. However, to see a snapshot of what our tradition remembered as saints back in 1979, just look in the front of our prayer book. There's a calendar. And when you look at it, one of the first things you'll notice is there is not a saint for every day of the church year. And then you'll notice that some are in bold print and others are not. Now, without going into great detail, we have open dates because we believe God's love, God's work, is alive and well in those who are still living. So no list of saints could ever be complete. There's always room to add more. And the reason some names are in bold and others are not goes back to part of the tradition we inherited. Those in bold were recognized more universally as saints, and those in the regular print were more local in nature. So what does it take to make the list? Interesting question, isn't it? In the back of Holy Women, Holy Men, there is a procedure for how we can submit names and even some criteria for selection. But like most things institutional, that published criteria can be rather confusing. So here is the bottom line. To be considered in our tradition for special recognition, someone must see the light of God shining in and through the person being nominated in such a way that it bears witness to the good news of salvation revealed in and through Jesus Christ. That's it. While we tend to see this more easily looking in the rearview mirror of life, I bet if we looked around this room, if we looked at those we know in our day-to-day lives, using that criteria, we could probably name someone we know, someone we see, a saint. Something to think about. People don't have to be dead to be a saint. So maybe we could then add those names that we have determined as saints to our own calendar of saints, thereby praying for the living as well as the dead, and taking time to remember and give thanks for what God has done and revealed through them. In just a few minutes, we're going to pray for those who we have seen let the light of God shine through themselves. Now, while some will have let that light shine through windows wide open, others may have only let it do so through a little crack. But that's okay. It doesn't really matter how much light shines through, only that it did. And that in remembering, we are reminded, like in our reading from Revelation, that we will once again be reunited with them. And, by the way, the great multitude from every nation, tribe, people, and language who, like us, have been washed clean in the blood of Christ, and through whom the light of God shines forth. The Reverend Leo Joseph once wrote, "There is an old Mexican saying that we die 3 deaths. The first is when our bodies die. The second, when our bodies are lowered into the ground out of sight. And the third is when our loved ones forget us. He goes on to say that Christians forestall this last death by seeing the faithful dead as members of the church, alive in Christ, and praying for them and asking them for their prayers for us. And while this encourages us to always remember, the good news is that whether we remember or not, they are not dead, but alive in Christ and in a place where both today's gospel and the reading from Revelation remind us there is no longer hunger or thirst for, nor fear of the things of this world, but a place where there is total awareness of peace, peace that comes from being filled with the love and glory